HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Improbable Wendell Willkie, the businessman who saved the Republican Party and his country and conceived a new world order, by David Levering Lewis, read by Mike Chamberlain. Preface. Wendell Lewis Willkie, 1892 to 1944, was one of the most exciting, intellectually able, and authentically transformational figures to stride the 20th century American political landscape. In an era of well-merited disgrace, Willkie served up the American business community's most reasoned, politically effective, and judicially nimble defense against government regulation of the free market economy. Wendell Willkie baited and debated Franklin Roosevelt, whose imperious sense of self-indispensability was turning his office into an imperial presidency, he warned with cracker-barrel farsightedness. His presidential campaign against Roosevelt was one of the toughest and bitterest, and most disorganized, after which, in defeat, he insisted that his party set a new standard of bipartisanship in Washington. He managed to outwit the isolationist leadership of the party, Herbert Hoover, Robert Taft, and Arthur Vandenberg, and engineer grudging recognition by the party platform of a qualified internationalism. Lewis Wendell Willkie, at age 25, he chose not to correct a U.S. Army clerk's transposition of his name, was a dynamic work in progress, a principled egoist who seldom allowed conventions to stand in his way. By age 42, this bear of a German-American lawyer from Elwood, Indiana, presided over Commonwealth and Southern, the nation's second or third largest private utility holding company. After a 5-year judicial slugfest in agile defense of free market electricity against the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, he wrenched a 1939 monetary settlement from the U.S. Treasury equivalent to $1.3 billion contemporary dollars. Wendell Willkie was certainly one of the most unexpected, if not unlikely, candidates for the presidency from a major national party. He was more unexpected than William Jennings Bryan, and only somewhat less unlikely than Barack Hussein Obama. The reaction of one New York GOP committeeman spoke volumes. When asked by a major contributor to pitch Willkie's candidacy to the clubhouse party loyalists, a dismayed Kenneth Simpson listed the difficulties. "They'll ask me, 'Willkie? Who's Willkie?' And I'll tell them he's president of the Commonwealth and Southern. And I will explain that it isn't a railroad, it's a public utility holding company. Then they will look at me sadly and say, 'Ken, we always have thought you were a little erratic, but now we know you're just plain crazy.' And that would be without my even getting to mention that he's a Democrat." In The Powers That Be, an exposé of the print media's capacity to manipulate public opinion, historian David Halberstam lent credence to the accusation that Willkie's political career was invented by a cabal of rich newspaper and magazine publishers educated at elite Eastern institutions, for example Henry Luce, Ogden Mills Reed, Gardner, and John Cowles. Yet Wendell's Democratic convictions were authentic. His well-publicized conflict with New Deal economic policies elicited plaudits from big business, yet his conception of responsible markets was more compatible with John Maynard Keynes's than with Adam Smith's. Wendell's farm boy haircut, hayseed manners, and sartorial indifference bespoke common man straightforwardness. "Grassroots stuff," said a wary FDR. But this businessman turned politician possessed a supple intellect, a remarkable fund of knowledge, and a concealed disdain for parochial ideas. Indeed, he was constantly to surprise many admirers and bitterly disappoint more than a few intimates who mistook Willkie's small-town Hoosier origins and big business success as the sum of the inner man. Wendell, a registered Democrat only 6 months earlier, captured the 1940 Republican presidential nomination in a media blitz of news publications, radio, film, and experimental television new to the nation. He unnerved Franklin Roosevelt in his bid for an unprecedented third term, and he won an unexpectedly large popular vote. He imported British notions of the loyal opposition into American politics after his defeat, forging the bipartisanship that made Roosevelt's foreign policy possible and United States' entry into World War II a certainty. With the war's outcome far from decided in 1942, Wendell lifted off that August on a round-the-world goodwill mission in a prototype B-24 with the blessings of FDR. Leader of his party, he took the principles of the Atlantic Charter seriously, dismaying Charles de Gaulle in Damascus and evoking Winston Churchill's memorable House of Commons retort regarding Egypt and India. He gave the boy Shah of Iran his first ride in a plane. He saw Beirut and Baghdad as distinguished world ambassador by day and adventurous student of their cultural character by night. He debated the virtues of private enterprise with Stalin. Geopolitics dictated that Wendell Willkie extol the staying power of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, despite the regime's metastasizing corruption. Sex and ambition dictated the tempestuous bonding of the ardent American visitor and the last empress, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. One world, a visionary credo based on the famous round-the-world maritime inspection tour, written with Irita Van Doren, literary book editor of the New York Herald Tribune, and Wendell's intellectual muse and lover, sold 1 million copies in 7 weeks, 2 million by the end of 1943, its first year. No book in the history of book publishing has been bought by so many people so quickly, Simon & Schuster's press release boasted, nor garnered more distinguished praise, with Clifton Fadiman and Walter Lippmann, seconded by Indiana legends Theodore Dreiser and Booth Tarkington, as a book whose author, said Tarkington, had personally experienced the small roundness of the 20th century world. One World foresaw the promise and peril for the post-war United States as a beacon of democracy in a world of decaying empires, rising plebeian expectations, vast Middle East oil deposits, and flammable Islam. The extraordinary impact in its many translations of One World was potent enough to nurture an international movement for the betterment of the world's peoples. A party leader whose rank and file was puzzled and appalled by many of his positions, Wendell defended the civil liberties of ideological pariahs, fascists and communists, in mass circulation magazines. He argued and won the landmark 1943 immigration case of Schneiderman v. U.S. before the U.S. Supreme Court. His espousal of full civil rights for colored Americans was unequaled among contenders for national office. His 1940 defeat by Roosevelt was in large part due to the fact that his progressive platform was almost a validation of his opponent's achievements. Wendell accepted the need to regulate the force of free enterprise, espoused collective bargaining for labor, federal regulation of interstate utilities, securities markets, and banking, and defended pensions, old age benefits, and unemployment allowances. Greatly, as the old guard lords hated Roosevelt, a sympathetic Democrat wrote, they had come to hate Willkie even more. Fired up by the old-time party religion, they assembled without him on Mackinac Island, Michigan, in the summer of 1943, drew up a new covenant half-heartedly inspired by him, then commanded their leader to renounce his ways and embrace the hallowed orthodoxy on pain of ostracism. Still official leader of his party, Wendell announced his presidential campaign on February 2, 1944. The candidate made the notable pledge to appoint a person of color to his cabinet or to the Supreme Court, and to use the full power of his office to end institutionalized racism. He was the first party leader to address the annual convention of the NAACP. Wendell Willkie sauntered away from a crushing repudiation of a second presidential run in the 1944 Wisconsin GOP primary, after which there is credible evidence of secret discussions with FDR for a realignment of the frequently dysfunctional two-party system. Had he taken better care of himself and curtailed the consumption of Scotch, he would almost certainly have continued to exercise a significant role in the unfolding drama of post-war politics in America. Alive, 5 years or so more, there would have been many more pages in the history books, perhaps a page relating one of the more intriguing collaborations in 20th century American civil rights. The leader of the Republican Party traveled twice to Hollywood with NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White in 1942 and 1943 in his capacity as chairman of the 20th Century Fox Board of Directors to mobilize the film industry for a paced and smarter and more positive presentation of blacks in film. His emergency committee of the entertainment industry was the model for Hollywood's support of civil rights activism 20 years later. He and NAACP head Walter White were planning a co-authored book on race relations shortly before Willkie's fatal coronary. Because black lives mattered greatly to him, the NAACP named its national headquarters building on New York's Fifth Avenue after Willkie. Willkie's sudden, unnecessary death in October 1944 came on the crest of domestic and international celebrity that surpassed his exceptional accomplishments as the GOP's formidable presidential candidate in 1940. Dead in his prime at 52, Willkie's prominence quickly dwindled from a notable profile in Irving Stone's They Also Ran to that of a once significant public figure about whom little is readily recalled. Taking the long view, however, Wendell Willkie's actual legacy to the post-war politics of the nation was decisive. The Republican Party's formal acceptance of foreign policy bipartisanship, achieved by Willkie the year before his death, emerged as a controlling post-war doctrine. GOP House Minority Leader Joseph Martin judged this to be Wendell Willkie's monument. Paradoxically, the party that disavowed its maverick standard-bearer entered the post-war world partially and grudgingly better adjusted to deal with complex international challenges because of its temporary and unanticipated capture by an extraordinary internationalist. He was a godsend to this country when we needed him most, FDR insisted. As a final judgment on his unique partner, the president's words were fitting. Harold Ickey's barefoot Wall Street lawyer and Claire Booth Luce's global Abraham Lincoln may have wanted Americans to remember the admonition from his posthumous essay collection, An American Program. Whatever we do at home constitutes foreign policy, and whatever we do abroad constitutes domestic policy. This is the great new political fact. John Gunther, the renowned global investigator, praised Willkie as one of the most forward-looking Americans of this or any time. Praise shy of hyperbole when one weighs the geopolitical prescience of one world against today's lethal reality of the West versus the rest. It all added up to the conviction, Willkie understood, that these newly awakened people will be followers of some extremist leader in this generation if their new hunger for education and opportunity for a release from old restrictive religious and governmental practice is not met by their own rulers and their foreign overlords. Again and again I was asked, does America intend to support a system by which our politics are controlled by foreigners, however indirectly, because we happen to be strategic points on the military roads and trade routes of the world? If we fail to help reform, the result will be of necessity either the complete withdrawal of outside powers with a complete loss of democratic influence, or complete military occupation and control of the countries by those outside powers. David Levering Lewis, New York City and Stanfordville, New York, 2018. Chapter 1. Elwood, August 17, 1940. An iconic photo preserves the event, the last of its kind in the campaign history of the American presidency. The Republican Party's 1940 nominee for the presidency of the United States came home to Elwood, Indiana, to accept his party's nomination. The heat was historic, too, that Saturday afternoon, August 17th. The thermometer in front of the Elwood Five and Dime registered 98 degrees in the shade as the Republican nominee's line of Lincoln automobiles rolled down South Anderson Street, flanked both sides by 5 growling police Harley-Davidsons. Time magazine reported 102 degrees. Marcia Davenport, Mozart's first American biographer and bemused New York witness to history unfolding in an unlikely place, personally saw a thermometer on somebody's porch that read 112. Even a few of the locals accustomed to the smackdown summer heat of the Indiana heartland had been strongly inclined to stay home that day, especially a sizable number of Democrats. Minus the bedridden and newborn, though, Elwoodians came to see the tall, dark-haired man with the piercing blue eyes who stood waving a white boater from the rear seat of a gleaming Lincoln Continental cabriolet, Wendell Lewis Willkie, born among them 48 years ago. Photographer J.D. Collins, on the flatbed truck ahead of the cortege, captured one of the most dynamic images in the history of presidential campaigning, a buoyant and beaming ship's prow of a Willkie sailing into a sea of thousands of exhilarated admirers. Seated with the nominee were Cora Wilk and Edith Willkie, Wendell Willkie's powder pigeon mother-in-law and his pert wife in her white platter of a good luck hat. Son Philip rode up front, proud, Ivy League precocious, and 21 next December. They looked the picture of a first family ideal. Wedged between Philip Willkie and the driver was Congressman Joseph Martin, the new House Minority Leader and new chair of the Republican National Committee. Martin's duty that day, in keeping with the practice of the times, was the formal presentation of the official nomination document. To look at the beaming Joe Martin, one would have supposed the veteran Massachusetts politician was having the time of his life as he rolled past several elephants, inflated and live, along the flag-bedecked route and saw national pole-sitting champion Alvin Shipwreck Kelly hoisted at a corner. The procession had left Elwood's quaint old nickel-plate railroad station on schedule at 12:30 p.m. A 500-strong American Legion Honor Guard from Akron, Ohio, along with the Indiana University Marching Band, stepped out front to the rousing strains of Back Home in Indiana, the unofficial state song. A sedan with Press Association on its windscreen and 2 security men on board followed the lead car. Then a second sedan carrying Indiana Congressman Charles Halleck, an early Willkie supporter who had placed Willkie's name in nomination before the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia. A third and fourth cabriolet followed with Elwood's mayor and Indiana University's emeritus president, a Catholic and Protestant prelate, and several important state and local businessmen and attorneys. There would never be another day like this one in a town whose major spectacle was the annual Miss Tomato Festival. 7 weeks earlier in Philadelphia, after 5 of the most unlikely convention days in its history, the Republican Party had nominated Wall Street attorney, utility company president, and, until recently, registered Democrat Wendell Lewis Willkie as its candidate for the presidency of the United States. Willkie was an overnight political sensation who had never held elective office, and who, when he announced his candidacy that May, had a Gallup handicap of 3%. Political neophyte and director of a billion-dollar corporation, Wendell Willkie might have seemed a decidedly problematic standard-bearer to appeal to an electorate unforgettably described 4 years earlier by Franklin Roosevelt as ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, and whose improved circumstances since then were due to the aristocratic architect of the New Deal, now seeking an unprecedented third term in the White House. Somehow, though, the Republican nominee inspired enthusiasm well beyond partisan bounds. Partly, it was the nominee's personality. Wendell Willkie's career epitomized rugged individualism. His Midwestern twang, unbuttoned affability, and radiant self-confidence seemed to strike a chord equally with the store clerk as with the banker. His record of success in business was just shy of fabulous, almost a decade of unbroken profit-taking of his giant corporation, Commonwealth and Southern, straight through the Great Depression. Partly, his appeal came from a cresting enthusiasm for a political reset. The GOP's stunning congressional gains in the 1938 off-year elections had revealed a large swath of the electorate grown weary of New Deal regulation and experimentation. Middle-class professionals disillusioned by years of tepid economic recovery were ready to give laissez-faire economics another try. In May, Willkie had been a far-fetched, if exciting, presidential speculation. By July, many veteran political observers said the presidency was his to lose. Already, there were Democrats for Willkie, appalled by Roosevelt's third-term arrogance. Nothing so extraordinary has ever happened in politics, Interior Secretary Harold Ickes told FDR in private. In public, Ickes lampooned the Republican contender as just a simple barefoot Wall Street lawyer, but an early August Gallup poll predicted a Willkie victory if the election were held that month. Willkie was certainly one of the most unexpected, if not unlikely, candidates for the presidency ever to come from a major national party. After all, he entered the Republican Party as a Wilsonian Democrat. Willkie was more unexpected than even Cross of Gold William Jennings Bryan in 1896, and only somewhat less unlikely than would-be Audacity of Hope Barack Hussein Obama in 2008. In The Powers That Be, an exposé of the print media's capacity to manipulate public opinion, the Paragon journalist David Halberstam lent credence to the accusation that Willkie's political career had been invented by a cabal of rich newspaper and magazine publishers educated at elite Eastern institutions. To be sure, his well-publicized conflict with New Deal economic policies elicited plaudits from big business, yet his conception of responsible markets was actually a precocious anticipation of the theory of countervailing powers advanced a decade later by economist John Kenneth Galbraith. This businessman turned politician was constantly to surprise many admirers and bitterly disappoint more than a few intimates who mistook Willkie's small-town Hoosier origins and big business success as the sum of the inner man. Even before his debut as a serious presidential contender, Willkie's May 1938 Founders' Day address at Indiana University, The Meaning of True Liberalism, could have put politicians of both the far left and far right on notice. The fact is, the liberal attempts the most difficult thing in the world, the returning alum insisted, namely, to strike a true balance between the rights of the individual and the needs of society. He is like a man rowing a boat who, when the boat swings to the right, pulls on the left, and when it swings to the left, pulls on the right. Booth Tarkington, vintage Hoosier novelist and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, summed up Willkie neatly. In a word, a man as American as the courthouse yard in the square of an Indiana county seat. Yet, this quintessential Hoosier had lived in a grand apartment on New York's Fifth Avenue since 1930. Faithful to his simple Indiana roots, however, Willkie liked to surprise friends by revealing that he kept his Manhattan apartment door unlocked, just as the family home had never been locked when he was a boy growing up in Elwood. Scarcely a man or woman in Elwood, Mayor George Bonham included, could have guessed that the Republican National Committee would choose their down-at-the-heels town, known for a tomato canning industry, as the site from which to launch its 1940 presidential campaign. A third of the town's people were on the federal and state relief rolls. It had as many Democrats as Republicans, and a significant number of Elwoodians favored the politics of the Ku Klux Klan or the revolving old-age pension scheme of California physician Francis Townsend. The fact that some 20 years had passed since the nominee had bothered to visit his birthplace made Elwood's people all the more astonished, and a fair number suspicious and even resentful that August day. That he was known to be an absentee landlord of 5 farms in Rushville, a prosperous township 55 miles southeast of Elwood, added to the sour feelings. Indeed, his national campaign headquarters was located in Rushville, with all that meant for infusions of cash diverted there from Elwood's merchants. Many years later, some of the locals were still heard to say, "He came to use us," that powerful outsiders had dusted off and buntinged up their unremarkable little town as a hayseed stage set for one of the most ambitiously scripted national contests ever mounted. Rumors spread of a brand-new stone monument over Willkie's parents' Elwood gravesite, a story that would occasion White House mirth when Labor Secretary Francis Perkins shared it with Franklin Roosevelt. The facts of what became Willkie Day were somewhat at variance with local memory, however. Elwood had scrambled smartly to get ready for their one-day unsolicited honor. It had mattered not a whit that the Republican National Committee offered the municipality neither money nor organizational talent. The Elwood Notification Nomination Committee sprang to life under the competent parenting of Hoosier businessman Homer Capehart. 2 years earlier, Capehart, a moon-faced Wurlitzer Music Company vice president, dubbed Father of the Jukebox, had organized a cornfield conference attended by some 20,000 Republicans on his 120-acre farm in Daviess County, Indiana. Capehart's generous checkbook and briefcase of pledges from cornfield conferees permitted the scaling up of the notification nomination committee's planning to accommodate as many as 150,000 plus attendees and 30,000 parking places. A cantankerous Democrat owned one of the 2 cornfields needed for the car park. The price was fantastic, $12,000. Capehart was known to sputter long after his service to Elwood's native son had helped Capehart win a seat in the U.S. Senate. By the time the nomination day preparations were ready on Friday evening, August 16th, Elwoodians discovered they were participants in an amazing spectacle that not even Homer Capehart's careful planning had fully anticipated. When the combined Elwood Constabulary, state police, and law officers from adjacent states closed the town to vehicular traffic at precisely 10 p.m. on Friday night as planned, a veritable flotilla of some 30,000 cars with license plates from every state in the Union was parked free on 160 acres of cleared cornfields, 15,000 more in a special area, another 11,000 on Elwood streets or in pay garages. The Chicago Tribune's airborne reporter filed a rhapsodic description of seamless traffic circulation worthy of the human cardiovascular system. Coming in on Route 28 at a rate of about 1,500 cars an hour. No blockade visible, he reported. By one count, 45,000 passengers had arrived from all points of the Midwest and beyond on 45 special Pennsylvania Railroad trains. Thousands more came on 2 special bus lines. With 30 years of experience as a food handler for large crowds, Chicago's Archie Rose estimated 30 tons of frankfurters, 10 tons of hamburger meat, and 18,000 ice cream specialties, most of it ready and waiting in refrigerated trucks in the city park. As Elwood closed itself Friday night, the Tribune carried a discordant squib about Elwood's only hotel, the 48-room Sidwell. Sleep well at the Sidwell. The Sidwell Hotel ran out of ice at 10 o'clock tonight. It hopes to get more. There was ceremony and pageantry on a stunning scale on appropriately called Willkie Day the next day. "Welcome home, Wendell Willkie," loudspeakers blared, as the self-assured politician reached out to shake so many hands that the driver was afraid the stop-and-go speed might cause the vapor lock for which the 12-cylinder Lincoln engines were notorious. The original nomination day plan had called for Elwood's famous son to deliver his acceptance speech from the steps of Central High School, the backdrop inspiration of Yale man Russell Davenport, Willkie's self-appointed political guru, recent Fortune magazine editor, and the gifted Marcia Davenport's husband. 8 years earlier, Franklin Roosevelt had made a dramatic departure from long-held tradition by flying to the Democratic Convention in Chicago to announce a New Deal for America. In well-advertised contrast to Roosevelt, Willkie decided this scalding Saturday in 1940 to follow tradition and present himself to the electorate from a place epitomizing the virtues of small-town America. The nominee intended to boast of pride in traditions, not in change for the mere sake of overthrowing precedents. His homecoming message from Middle America was intended to serve notice that the politics of big government and the economics of class resentment spawned by the New Deal were destined for repudiation. When Willkie Day came, however, the speech from the steps of Central High School, whose front portal was crowned by the proud inscription, "The Hope of Our Country," was no longer the centerpiece in the nomination production. Capehart's planning committee had persuaded Willkie to give his address from an elevated wooden platform erected in Callaway Park at the northern edge of the town. But Central High School's location was still too important as a photographic prop to eliminate. The sentimental prop nearly proved disastrous, however, when Willkie's driver forgot his instructions to veer off and drive behind the school. Instead, the car was finally forced to a stop as it wedged deeper into the uproarious sea of humanity on Main Street. Time's description of the moment was frightening. Stuck solidly for 15 minutes in a temperature of 102 degrees, only Wendell Willkie's 220 pounds kept.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?